Standing beside my husband's casket at Riverside Memorial Cemetery, I never expected my phone to buzz with a message that would shatter my entire world. The text was from an unknown number, and the words made my blood run cold. "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket. Don't trust our sons." If you're ready for a story of shocking betrayal, devastating revenge, and a widow's fight for justice, please hit that like button, subscribe to Formidable Revenge channel, share this incredible story, and comment below to let me know where you're watching from around the world. My name is Isabella Martinez, and at 64 years old, I thought I had seen everything life could throw at me. But nothing prepared me for discovering that my own flesh and blood had orchestrated the most heinous crime imaginable. The funeral for my beloved husband Roberto was supposed to be my final goodbye to the man who had been my everything for 40 years. Instead, it became the beginning of the most terrifying chapter of my life. Roberto and I met when I was just 22, working as a seamstress in our small town of Cedar Falls, Illinois. He was 25, running his father's auto repair shop with hands that could fix anything broken. We fell in love over shared lunches and dreams of building something beautiful together. Our wedding was simple but filled with hope, just family, friends, and promises of forever under the old maple tree in Central Park. Those early years tested us. We lived in a tiny apartment above Murphy's Deli, surviving on love and determination. When our first son Antonio was born, I thought my heart would explode with joy. 2 years later, Sebastian arrived, completing our little family. I devoted everything to those boys. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every penny we earned went toward giving them the best life possible. Roberto worked 16-hour days at Martinez Auto Repair, building the business from nothing into the most trusted shop in 3 counties. I took in sewing work, mending clothes, and altering wedding dresses to help make ends meet. We weren't rich, but we were rich in love, laughter, and the unbreakable bond of a family that truly cared for each other. But as Antonio and Sebastian grew older, I watched them change in ways that broke my heart. Antonio, always ambitious, started questioning why we lived so modestly. "Why don't we have a BMW like the Hendersons?" he'd ask with increasing resentment. Sebastian, ever his older brother's shadow, soon adopted the same attitude of embarrassment toward our simple life. When Antonio turned 19, Roberto offered him a partnership in the shop. The rejection was brutal and public. "I'm not going to waste my life getting grease under my fingernails like you, Dad. I have bigger plans." The pain in Roberto's eyes that night haunts me still. His own son had rejected not just his offer, but his entire way of life. Against all odds, both boys managed to claw their way into successful careers in Chicago. Antonio landed a position at Premier Real Estate, while Sebastian found his way into investment banking. Suddenly, my sons were making more money in a month than Roberto and I had ever seen in a year. At first, I felt proud. My babies had escaped the cycle of financial struggle that had defined our lives. But success poisoned them. Visits became rare, phone calls grew shorter, and when they did come home, they arrived in expensive cars wearing designer suits, looking at their childhood home with barely concealed disgust. Antonio married Victoria Blackwell, a cold socialite from the North Shore who never bothered to hide her contempt for our quaint little lifestyle. The pressure started subtly. Comments about how we should upgrade our living situation. Suggestions that Roberto should retire from the dangerous work at the shop. Antonio would bring real estate brochures for senior communities, while Sebastian talked endlessly about better investment opportunities for our modest savings. 3 months before Roberto's death, the pressure intensified dramatically. Both sons began showing up unannounced, asking pointed questions about our insurance policies, our will, and the value of the shop and our home. When I asked why they suddenly cared so much about our finances, they claimed it was concern for our advancing age and declining judgment. I should have known something sinister was brewing. I should have protected the man I loved from the monsters our children had become. Roberto Martinez was the kind of man who made the world better simply by existing in it. At 66, he still woke up every morning at 5 a.m., made me coffee exactly the way I liked it, 2 sugars, a splash of cream, and kissed my forehead before heading to his beloved shop. He knew every customer's name, remembered their children's birthdays, and never charged a widow or struggling family full price for repairs. His death came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 1 week after he'd confided his growing suspicions about our sons to me. "Isabella, mi amor," he'd said while we sat on our front porch swing, "something isn't right with Antonio and Sebastian. They ask too many questions about money, about insurance. Yesterday, Sebastian wanted to know exactly how much life insurance I carry. Why would he need to know that?" I had brushed off his concerns as paranoia, telling him our boys were just worried about our future. How wrong I was. The call came at 9:47 a.m. I was kneading dough for Roberto's favorite bread when the phone rang with an urgency that made my stomach drop. "Mrs. Martinez? This is Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Your husband has been in a serious accident. You need to come immediately." The drive to Chicago felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My neighbor Patricia had to drive because I was shaking too violently to hold the steering wheel. All I could think about was Roberto's smile that morning, how he'd promised to be home early so we could watch our favorite cooking show together. When I arrived at the hospital, Antonio and Sebastian were already there, which struck me as odd since I was Roberto's emergency contact. How had they known about the accident before me? "Mama," Antonio said, embracing me with what seemed like genuine emotion, "Papa's condition is very serious. The doctors say there was an explosion at the shop. He has severe burns and traumatic brain injury." Sebastian's red-rimmed eyes looked appropriately devastated, but something felt performative about his grief. He kept checking his phone and seemed more anxious than heartbroken, like someone waiting for important news rather than mourning his dying father. For 3 agonizing days, I lived at the hospital. Roberto lay unconscious, connected to machines that beeped and hummed constantly. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about infection, brain swelling, and slim chances of recovery. But what disturbed me most was my son's behavior. While I held Roberto's hand and begged him to fight, Antonio was on the phone with insurance companies. Sebastian researched end-of-life options, and spoke quietly with attorneys about estate planning. When I confronted them about their coal deficiency, they claimed they were just being practical, handling the business aspects so I wouldn't have to worry. "Mama," Sebastian said on the second day, "we've reviewed Papa's policies. There's $75,000 in life insurance, plus a workers' compensation policy that could pay another $100,000. You'll be financially secure." Why was he talking about money while his father fought for his life? Why was he so knowledgeable about insurance policies I didn't even know existed? On the 3rd night, something miraculous happened. While I sat beside Roberto's bed, his fingers squeezed mine with unmistakable intention. His lips moved as if trying to speak. I called frantically for the nurses, but by the time they arrived, he had slipped back into unconsciousness. "Sometimes there are involuntary muscle spasms," the nurse explained dismissively. But I knew my husband. Roberto had been trying to tell me something important. 48 hours later, at 3:22 a.m., the machines began their final, terrible alarm. I watched in horror as doctors worked desperately to save the man who had been my anchor for 4 decades. After 30 minutes of futile efforts, Dr. Harrison delivered the words that destroyed my world. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Martinez. Roberto is gone." The strangest part was how prepared my sons seemed for their father's death. They arrived at the hospital within an hour, carrying paperwork, funeral home contacts, and insurance claim forms. Their grief seemed rehearsed, their efficiency unsettling. Something was terribly wrong, but I was too shattered to think clearly. The funeral arrangements happened without my input. Antonio chose everything: the cheapest casket, the briefest service, the smallest possible gathering. When I protested, he claimed Roberto would have wanted something simple and dignified. But Roberto deserved better than this indecent rush to bury and forget him. The funeral service felt more like a business meeting than a celebration of Roberto's extraordinary life. Only 23 people attended, a pathetic turnout for a man who had touched hundreds of lives in Cedar Falls. Where were his customers from the shop? Where were the neighbors he'd helped countless times? Where was the community that had loved and respected Roberto Martinez for 40 years? We kept it small and private, Antonio explained when I asked. Papa was a humble man. He wouldn't have wanted a big fuss. But that wasn't true. Roberto loved people, loved his community. He would have wanted them to say goodbye. During the brief service, I watched my sons with growing suspicion. Antonio checked his Rolex repeatedly, as if he had somewhere more important to be than his father's funeral. Sebastian fidgeted with his phone behind his black suit jacket. Victoria barely concealed her boredom behind designer sunglasses. This was how they honored the man who had sacrificed everything for their success. When Pastor Williams spoke about Roberto's legacy of love and service, his words felt hollow against the cold indifference of my own family. I didn't want Roberto to rest in peace. I wanted him to come home with me, for us to grow old together as we'd planned. Then came that devastating moment when my phone buzzed. The message from an unknown number, "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket." With trembling hands, I typed back, "Who are you?" The response chilled me to the bone. "I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons." Standing there beside what I thought was my husband's grave, I felt reality crumble around me. Either someone was playing the cruelest joke imaginable, or something far more sinister was happening. That night, alone in our house that now felt like a tomb, I began investigating. In Roberto's desk, I found documents I'd never seen before. His life insurance policy had been mysteriously increased from $10,000 to $75,000 just 4 months before his death. There was also a workers' compensation policy I knew nothing about, worth another $100,000 in case of accidental death. When had Roberto made these changes? Why hadn't he told me? And more disturbing, who had suggested he needed so much more coverage? My phone buzzed again. Check the bank records. See who's been moving money. The next morning, I drove to First National Bank where Roberto and I had kept our accounts for 35 years. Mrs. Patterson, the branch manager, greeted me with sincere condolences. "I need to review our accounts," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady. What I discovered made my blood freeze. Over the past 4 months, large withdrawals have been made from our savings. $2,000 in November, $4,000 in December, $6,000 in January, and $8,000 just 2 weeks before Roberto's death. $20,000, our entire life savings gone. Who authorized these withdrawals? I demanded. Your husband came in personally, Mrs. Patterson explained. He said he needed the money for major shop renovations. Sebastian was with him a few times, helping with the paperwork because Roberto's arthritis was making it hard for him to write. Lies. All lies. Roberto's hands were perfectly steady, and he'd never mentioned any renovations. Our shop was small but well maintained. It didn't need $20,000 in improvements. Do you have the withdrawal slips? I asked. She showed me the documents. The signature looked like Roberto's, but something was off. The handwriting was shakier than his usual confident script, and some letters were formed differently. Had someone forged his signature? Or had he been coerced into signing under duress? That evening, I received another message. The explosion story is a lie. Roberto never had an accident at the shop. They poisoned him. My hands began shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone. How do you know this? I typed back. I was hired to protect you both. I failed to save Roberto, but I can still save you. Meet me tomorrow at Riverside Diner, Booth 7, at 2 p.m. Come alone, and don't tell anyone. I stared at the message until the words blurred. Someone had been watching us, protecting us? And if Roberto hadn't died in an explosion, if he'd been deliberately poisoned, then everything my sons had told me was a carefully constructed lie. But why? What could possibly motivate Antonio and Sebastian to murder their own father? The answer, I was beginning to realize, was as old as humanity itself: greed. I barely slept that night, my mind racing between disbelief and growing horror. By morning, I had convinced myself that stress and grief were making me paranoid. Maybe the mysterious messages were just cruel pranks. Maybe the bank withdrawals had innocent explanations. Maybe I was losing my mind. But when 2 p.m. arrived, I found myself walking into Riverside Diner anyway. Booth 7 was occupied by a man in his 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that had seen too much. He wore a simple brown jacket and had the weathered look of someone who spent his life dealing with other people's secrets. "Mrs. Martinez," he said softly as I approached. "My name is Detective Frank Morrison. I'm retired Chicago PD, now working as a private investigator." I slid into the booth across from him, my heart hammering. "You're the one who's been sending me messages?" "Yes, ma'am. And I'm sorry for the cryptic approach, but I needed to be sure you were safe before revealing myself." He placed a manila folder on the table between us. "Roberto hired me 6 weeks before his death. He was convinced your sons were planning something terrible, but he didn't know exactly what." The words hit me like physical blows. "Roberto hired you? But why didn't he tell me?" "He didn't want to worry you unless he had proof. Your husband was a smart man, Mrs. Martinez. He knew his sons had changed, and their sudden interest in his finances set off alarm bells." Detective Morrison opened the folder, revealing photographs, documents, and what looked like audio equipment. "Roberto asked me to install listening devices in your home and monitor your son's activities. What I discovered was far worse than even he suspected." He pressed play on a small digital recorder. Sebastian's voice filled the space between us, crystal clear and absolutely damning. "The old man's getting suspicious. Yesterday he asked me why I needed to know about his life insurance. We need to move faster." Then Antonio's voice: "I already have the ricin. It's odorless, tasteless, and the symptoms mimic a heart attack. The doctors will never suspect poisoning." I felt the world tilt on its axis. My own sons, discussing their father's murder with the casual tone they might use to talk about weekend plans. The recording continued. "Sebastian, what about Mama?" "Antonio, once Papa's dead and we collect the insurance money, we'll have her declared mentally incompetent. Grief-induced dementia. Dr. Caldwell already agreed to sign the papers for $10,000. Sebastian, and then?" "Antonio, then we control everything. The house, the shop, the insurance money. We're looking at almost $300,000 total. Enough to pay off my debts and yours too." I was shaking so violently that Detective Morrison reached across the table to steady my hands. "I know this is devastating, but you need to hear it all." The final recording was from the morning of Roberto's death. "Antonio, I put the ricin in his coffee this morning. He should start feeling sick in about 4 hours. By tonight, he'll be in the hospital, and by tomorrow, he'll be dead." "Sebastian, you're sure the symptoms will look natural?" "Antonio, absolutely. Difficulty breathing, organ failure, doctors will assume it's a heart attack or stroke. And I already planted the explosion story. When Mama asks questions, we'll tell her Papa died in an accident at the shop." I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred as the full scope of their betrayal became clear. Not only had my sons murdered their father, but they'd planned to steal everything we'd worked for and have me declared insane if I got in their way. "There's more," Detective Morrison said gently. "Your sons are in serious financial trouble. Antonio owes $150,000 to private lenders who've started making threats. Sebastian lost $80,000 in bad investments and has been stealing from his company to cover the losses." He showed me bank records, loan documents, and threatening letters. My successful sons were actually desperate criminals who saw their parents as nothing more than a source of easy money. Why didn't you stop them? I whispered through my tears. I tried. I called Roberto the morning he died, warned him not to drink anything his sons gave him. But I was too late. He'd already had his coffee. The man I'd loved for 40 years had been murdered by our own children, and I'd been too blind to see it coming. But now I knew the truth. And now, finally, I could fight back. Detective Morrison leaned forward, his expression deadly serious. Mrs. Martinez, your sons think they've gotten away with the perfect crime. But they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated their father's intelligence and your strength. I wiped away my tears, feeling something harder than grief settling in my chest. What do we do now? We gather more evidence and set a trap. According to my surveillance, they're planning to have you declared mentally incompetent within the next 2 weeks. Dr. Richard Caldwell, a corrupt psychiatrist, has already prepared false documentation stating that you're suffering from severe depression and early-stage dementia. The audacity of their plan was breathtaking. Murder their father, steal his money, and then destroy their mother's life to cover their tracks. But here's what they don't know, Detective Morrison continued. Roberto recorded a video confession the day before he died. He suspected they were going to kill him, and he wanted to make sure the truth came out. My heart nearly stopped. Roberto knew? He'd figured out most of it. The insurance changes, the bank withdrawals, the sudden interest in his death benefits. He even suspected the poisoning, though he couldn't prove it yet. Detective Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed me a video file dated the day before Roberto's death. There was my husband, sitting in his shop office, looking directly into the camera with the serious expression he wore when discussing important matters. Isabella, my love, Roberto's voice said from beyond the grave. If you're watching this, it means my suspicions were correct, and our sons have murdered me for money. I know this will break your heart, but you need to know the truth about Antonio and Sebastian. Hearing his voice again made me sob uncontrollably, but I forced myself to keep listening. I hired Detective Morrison because I was afraid. Our boys have changed into people I don't recognize. They've been pressuring me to increase my life insurance, asking about our will, and yesterday I caught Sebastian going through my desk when he thought I wasn't looking. They're planning something terrible, Isabella. Don't trust them. Don't let them control you. Fight for justice, for us, for the memory of the family we thought we'd raised. The video ended, leaving me with a mixture of devastation and determination. Roberto had known, and he tried to protect me even after death. There's more evidence, Detective Morrison said. I recorded their celebration dinner the night after Roberto's funeral. He played another audio file. I could hear champagne glasses clinking and my sons' voices, drunk with success and alcohol. Antonio, to Papa's timely departure and our financial freedom. Sebastian, I can't believe it was that easy. The old fool drank the poison without suspecting a thing. Victoria's voice joined in, now we can finally live the life we deserve. No more embarrassing visits to that pathetic little house. Antonio, speaking of which, we need to move fast on having Mama committed. Dr. Caldwell says the process takes about 2 weeks once we file the paperwork. Sebastian, what if she fights it? Antonio, what's she going to fight with? We control everything now. Besides, who's going to believe a crazy old woman grieving her dead husband? Their laughter was the most chilling sound I'd ever heard. These weren't my children anymore. They were monsters wearing familiar faces. We're going to use their arrogance against them, Detective Morrison explained. Tomorrow you're going to call Antonio and tell him you've been having episodes, confusion, memory loss, hallucinations about Roberto being alive. Play into their expectations. Make them think their plan is working perfectly. And then we wait for them to make their move. When they try to have you committed, we'll have Sergeant Williams from the Cedar Falls Police Department ready with arrest warrants. We'll catch them in the act of trying to destroy your life. The plan was risky, but it was our only chance to get justice for Roberto and prevent my sons from destroying any more lives. There's one more thing, Detective Morrison added. We're going to need Roberto's body exhumed for a proper autopsy. The funeral home Antonio chose has a history of covering up suspicious deaths for the right price. We need medical proof of the ricin poisoning. The thought of disturbing Roberto's rest broke my heart, but I knew he would understand. Justice required proof, and proof required sacrifice. Whatever it takes, I said firmly. Roberto deserves justice, and these monsters need to pay for what they've done. The war was about to begin. The next morning, I called Antonio with my best performance of a grief-stricken, confused widow. "Mijo," I said, letting my voice shake with manufactured frailty, "I'm so scared. I keep seeing Papa in the house. Last night, I swear I heard his voice calling my name from the shop." There was a brief pause before Antonio's carefully concerned response. "Mama, that sounds very serious. Hallucinations can be a sign of a bigger problem. Maybe you should see a doctor." "I don't know what's real anymore," I continued, playing my role perfectly. "Yesterday, I couldn't remember where I put Papa's insurance papers. And this morning, I found myself making coffee for 2 people instead of 1. I could practically hear the excitement in Antonio's voice, though he tried to disguise it as worry. "I'm coming over right away, Mama. You shouldn't be alone when you're having these episodes." Within an hour, both my sons arrived at my house with Dr. Caldwell in tow, a thin, weaselly man with cold eyes and an expensive suit. They'd come prepared to have me evaluated and declared mentally incompetent on the spot. "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Caldwell said with fake compassion, "your sons are very concerned about your mental state. I understand you've been experiencing some confusion and hallucinations." "The dead don't stay dead," I whispered, wrapping my bathrobe tighter around myself. "Roberto keeps trying to tell me something, but I can't understand what he's saying." Dr. Caldwell scribbled notes on his clipboard, while my sons exchanged satisfied glances. They thought they were watching their plan unfold perfectly. "Based on what I'm observing," Dr. Caldwell announced after a laughably brief examination, "Mrs. Martinez is clearly suffering from severe grief-induced psychosis. She needs immediate psychiatric care." "What kind of care?" Sebastian asked, though we all knew he already had the answer prepared. "Hillcrest Manor has an excellent program for patients with her condition. She could be admitted as early as this afternoon." Hillcrest Manor, I'd researched it after Detective Morrison's warning. It was a private psychiatric facility where wealthy families sent inconvenient relatives to disappear. Once I was committed there, my sons would have complete control over my finances and property. "I don't want to go to a hospital," I said, continuing my act. "I want to stay in my house with Roberto's memory." "Mama," Antonio said with convincing gentleness, "you're not well. We just want to take care of you, like you took care of us." The irony of his words made my stomach turn. They were preparing to destroy my life while claiming to care for me. "I need to pack some things," I said weakly. "Can I have a few minutes alone?" "Of course," Sebastian said. "We'll wait in the living room." I went to my bedroom and immediately texted Detective Morrison, "They're here with the psychiatrist. Moving to phase 2 now." His response was instant, "Units in position. Recording everything. You're doing great." I returned to the living room where my sons and Dr. Caldwell were already discussing my treatment plan and the legal procedures for taking control of my assets. "I'm ready," I announced quietly. But instead of going toward the door, I walked to the kitchen and returned with Roberto's old radio, which I placed on the coffee table. "What are you doing, Mama?" Antonio asked with slight irritation. "Roberto asked me to play this for you," I said, pressing the play button. Sebastian's voice filled the room. "The old man's getting suspicious. We need to move faster." Then Antonio's voice, "I already have the ricin. It's odorless, tasteless, and the symptoms mimic a heart attack. The color drained from all three men's faces. Dr. Caldwell dropped his clipboard, while my sons stared at the radio in absolute horror. "You see," I continued, my voice no longer shaky but strong and clear, "I'm not crazy at all. I'm just a widow who discovered that her own children murdered their father for insurance money." Antonio lunged toward the radio, but it was too late. The door burst open and Detective Morrison entered with 3 Cedar Falls police officers, guns drawn. "Antonio Martinez and Sebastian Martinez, you're under arrest for the murder of Roberto Martinez and conspiracy to commit fraud," Detective Morrison announced. "Dr. Caldwell, you're under arrest for participating in a conspiracy to commit involuntary commitment and insurance fraud." The look of shock and rage on my sons' faces was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Justice, at last, was served. The trial of Antonio and Sebastian Martinez became the most sensational case in Cedar Falls history. For 3 weeks, the courthouse was packed with neighbors, former customers of Roberto's shop, and reporters who'd come to witness 2 sons being prosecuted for murdering their father. I testified on the first day, wearing Roberto's favorite blue dress and the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 20th anniversary. As I took the witness stand, I looked directly at my sons, who sat in their orange jumpsuits with expressions of defeat and shame. "Mrs. Martinez," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court about your relationship with the defendants before your husband's murder?" "I thought I knew them," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "I raised them with love, sacrificed everything for their happiness, and believed they loved their father and me in return. I was wrong. The men sitting over there are not the children I raised. They're strangers who saw their parents as obstacles to money they felt entitled to steal." The prosecution played every recording Detective Morrison had captured. The courtroom fell silent as Antonio and Sebastian's voices filled the air, coldly discussing Roberto's murder as if planning a grocery shopping trip. When the tape reached the part where they laughed about Roberto drinking the poison, without suspecting a thing, several jurors wiped away tears. The medical examiner's testimony was devastating. Roberto's exhumed body contained lethal levels of ricin, administered approximately 6 hours before his death. The poison had caused organ failure that would have been agonizing and slow. Roberto had suffered terribly in his final hours. Dr. Caldwell had already pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges in exchange for his testimony against my sons. He explained how Antonio had approached him months earlier, asking about procedures for having elderly relatives declared mentally incompetent. He offered me $25,000 to evaluate his mother and provide documentation supporting a mental incompetency claim, Dr. Caldwell testified. He said she was becoming difficult to manage regarding family finances. Victoria took the stand in her own defense, claiming she knew nothing about the murder plot. But Detective Morrison had recorded her celebrating Roberto's death and discussing plans to force me into a psychiatric facility. Her tears and denials fell on deaf ears. The defense attorneys tried to portray Antonio and Sebastian as desperate men who'd made terrible decisions under financial pressure. They presented evidence of the gambling debts, the threatening loan sharks, the failed investments that had driven my sons to desperation. But the prosecution's closing argument was devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen, financial pressure doesn't excuse murder. Thousands of people face bankruptcy without poisoning their parents. These defendants didn't just kill Roberto Martinez, they betrayed the most fundamental bond in human society. They murdered the man who'd sacrificed everything to give them life and opportunity." After deliberating for 8 hours, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Antonio received life in prison without possibility of parole. Sebastian received the same sentence. Victoria was sentenced to 15 years for conspiracy and fraud. As the judge read their sentences, I felt Roberto's presence in that courtroom. Justice had been served, but at a cost that would haunt me forever. 6 months after the trial, I established the Roberto Martinez Foundation for Victims of Family Violence. Using the insurance money that had cost Roberto his life, we now help families who've been betrayed by their own relatives. Detective Morrison serves as our chief investigator, helping uncover cases where family members prey on their loved ones. I still live in our little house in Cedar Falls, but I've converted Roberto's shop into a community center where we provide free legal aid and counseling for victims of family crimes. His tools hang on the walls like memorials, and his workbench has been transformed into a desk where we help families fight for justice. Every Sunday, I visit Roberto's grave with fresh flowers from the garden we planted together. I tell him about the families we've helped, the justice we've achieved, and how his death wasn't in vain. "You were right to be suspicious, mi amor," I whispered during my last visit. "And you were right to prepare for the worst. Because of your courage, we saved other families from suffering what we endured." Sometimes, I swear I can feel his hand on my shoulder, proud of the woman I've become in his absence. A fighter. A protector. A force for justice in a world where even family can't always be trusted. Roberto Martinez died because of greed, but his legacy lives on in every family we save from the same betrayal. The dead may not speak, but they can still achieve justice through those who love them enough to fight.